Hello, once again, YouTube. What you hear in the background is Minor Fair from Straight Life by Jimmy Smith, and this is another Jazz Views with CJ Shern short video review. Let me just turn this down. Okay. As you know, I mentioned in my previous review this album, Straight Life, when I reviewed Jimmy Smith Plays Fat Swaller. This is my sort of continued tribute to one of my favorite musicians of all time, if not the favorite of all time, Jimmy Smith. And this album, Straight Life, is unusual in that it was Jimmy's only studio session in 1961 for Blue Note, recorded on June 22nd. And it was issued for the first time in 2007 as a Connoisseur Series CD, which, of course, that was a series that Blue Note started in 1994 to issue sessions that were long out of print. Eventually, it grew to the point where the Connoisseur Series would include sessions that had never been released before, such as Art Blakey's Drums Around the Corner in 1999, as well as another Jimmy Smith session called Six Views of the Blues. Anyway, Straight Life is unusual for the very fact that it very much follows the same kind of mood and terrain of Plays Fat Swaller, which was an album that was issued during the classic era of Blue Note Records. And this album is also one that Jimmy was soon to be with Verve Records, making his first record for Verve, Bashin', in, I believe, March 1962. And Jimmy had several contractual obligation records to make for Blue Note, of which he made 4 in a series of a week in February 1963. And these albums included a quartet date with Stanley Turrentine, which was nothing really out of the ordinary at that time. A quartet date with Lou Donaldson, and Jimmy Smith and Lou Donaldson hadn't recorded as a quartet since the Jimmy Smith Trio plus Lou Donaldson recorded in July 1957, and the only trio session ever with guitarist Grant Green, who was also a Blue Note label mate. And there was one more session with Jimmy's regular trio, Bucket, which in my opinion is the weakest of those sessions. And Straight Life then is his only contribution in 1961. Now, there's something that makes the album unusual in terms of the sound of Jimmy's organ. Of course, by that time, Jimmy Smith, as well as every other organist who recorded at the Van Gelder Studio, like Jack McDuff, John Patton, Johnny Hammond Smith, and vice versa, they were all using a Hammond C3 organ. And a Hammond C3 organ is the same internally as a Hammond B3, except the case is a lot bigger, I guess, because churches were accommodating the C3 model. So, why is the sound of the organ unusual? Well, as far as Jimmy's sound in the 60s goes, he was using the first 3 drawbars out with the third harmonic percussion on exclusively. And this was a sound that he first used at the Club Baby Grand in 1956, which are his fourth and fifth albums for the label. His original organ, a Hammond B2, didn't have percussion, so he was using the last drawbar out with that whistle that it produces for a time, and then he was using the first three drawbars out without percussion for a time between 1957 and 1958, and most famously the album Groovin' at Small's Paradise from November 1957 features the infamous Paradise Switch setting, which is where the percussion sustains indefinitely. So Jimmy was using the first three drawbars out with the percussion just sort of stuck on, creating a, I think, really, really cool sound. So the reason why the sound is unusual on Straight Life is because he's using the three drawbars without percussion, which is something that he hadn't really done since 1958. So the session kind of weirdly enough sounds like something from 1958, but that would have been impossible because the trio is with Quentin Warren on guitar, who joined in 1959, replacing Eddie McFadden, and Donald Bailey on drums, and it was recorded at the Van Gelder Studio in Englewood Cliffs, which did not exist in 1958. The Englewood Cliffs studio was first used on a Blue Note record for an Ike Quebec 45 session, I believe, in 1959. And that was the famous studio that Rudy completely built himself, independent of his parents' Hackensack, New Jersey studio. So that the fact that Jimmy's only using the first three drawbars without percussion made many on the Organissimo jazz forums, which I've been a part of for many years, speculate at the time of release that this was a session that maybe was from the late 50s. And also, the choice of material is rather unusual. There's standards like Here's to My Lady, Stardust. These are tunes that Jimmy hadn't really recorded, and he had recorded a lot of interesting choices for standards in the late 50s and early 60s. Not so much when he transitioned to the big band era on Verve. But the other thing that makes the session fairly unusual is that it's rather laid back to compared to what was released by Blue Note of Jimmy Smith at the time. It certainly doesn't have the energy of Crazy Baby, which was recorded in January 1960, or Midnight Special, back at the Chicken Shack. It doesn't have that fire. It doesn't have the fire of Open House, for example. And there's a fair number of squabble tunes, also, which puts it in line with Play's Fat Swaller. And once again, the squabble setting is the first and last five drawbar settings on the Hammond out, with the tremolo on and the third percussion still on, I believe. So this album is one that, while it's a worthy addition to the Jimmy Smith catalog, I would only give it about a 7.5 out of 10, because you don't really need it unless you are a Jimmy Smith completist or you are somebody who collects all of his Blue Note recordings. And his Blue Note recordings are by far the best music that he ever made in his career. And this is a session that, since it was not originally released at the time, it doesn't really factor in with the classic albums that were released back then. It's a nice enough album, but the choice of material and the overall mellowness kind of makes it suffer. Although, with all of that said, the tune Minor Fair is an interesting tune because it features Afro 12/8 head, and there's not a lot of Jimmy Smith tunes from that time period, if at all, that have that sort of rhythmic thing going on. And it also could have been released as a single, and if it had, it probably could have become one of Jimmy's best known tunes. It's got a really nice melody, and also there's a standard Jimmy Smith F blues called Jimmy's Blues. That's one that, had that been released as a single at the time, it might have been considered a noteworthy tune. So, that said, Jimmy Smith, Straight Life, again, entitled not to be confused with Freddie Hubbard's 1970 classic CTI album or Art Pepper's tune, 7.5 out of 10. This is Jazz Views with CJ Shern. Peace, love, groove, and keep swinging, everybody.